I'm a great admirer of the Climate Reality Project founded by Al Gore. So I'm happy to address Climate Reality Europe at the start of your event on climate justice, energy transition, green communities, which will happen during COP27. It's really important as we're preparing for COP27, the African COP, that you have, and we all have, a people-centered approach and are conscious of the injustices that lie behind the climate crisis. We know that most of the carbon emissions are caused historically and now by industrialized countries, and that large emerging economies like China, India, Russia are also contribute increasingly to the problem. But the worst impacts, as you know, are felt by the poorest countries and poorest communities who are least responsible. And we need to bear that in mind. We need to have a climate justice, people-centered approach. And I've identified about 5 layers of injustice that I just want to speak about briefly. The first is the one I've already been referencing, that the climate crisis has hit much earlier and much more severely the poorest countries, the poorest communities, the small island states, the indigenous peoples, who also, by and large, are the Black and brown and indigenous people of our world. So in that way, it's also a racial injustice. Secondly, there's the injustice that is gender injustice within that, because of the different social roles of women, often the lack of rights, even land rights, the lack of access to credit, the lack of being at the table for decision making. And yet it's women who have to build resilience in their communities, who have to go further for water or firewood during prolonged drought, or cope with flooding, cope with hurricanes, etc. That gender injustice has now been well understood, and yet we don't see money going to women on the ground as much as it should to build resilience. Thirdly, the intergenerational injustice. And I don't need to say much about this because young people, even school children with their Fridays for Future, have been calling us out and saying, don't load us with impossible problems. Take decisions now. We can't take them, but we're asking you to take your responsibility. And of course, we're not doing it enough. The fourth injustice is subtle, but it's important. Industrialized countries, we built our economies on fossil fuel. So we have a responsibility to acknowledge a debt, to value the work of workers in coal and oil and gas, and in my country, peat, turf, and to care about their communities in a just transition, that there will be green jobs, that there will be training, that there will be pensioning off if necessary, but that there will be a real bringing with through a just transition out of those fossil fuels, a just transition into clean energy. And the fifth injustice is the injustice to nature herself, this awful loss of biodiversity, this terrible extinction of species, about which there was a report just a few days ago. A climate justice approach essentially is also an intergenerational approach. And I encourage you to be very intergenerational in your meeting. And so at COP27, it's important that G20 countries would step up with more ambitious NDCs, as they promised they would in Glasgow. You remember the decision was taken, we will do it 1 year now, we'll do it at COP27, but they're not doing it. Very few have actually made their NDCs more ambitious. Secondly, we need to have more attention to another commitment in Glasgow, which was to double climate adaptation finance by 2025. There's no real roadmap for that. There's no real push for that at the moment. And it's a big increase in adaptation, which is so vital to countries, developing countries coming to COP27. And thirdly, and really importantly, we need to have a financing mechanism for loss and damage. We see now that the climate crisis is so severe, it goes beyond adaptation. Look at the terrible problems at the moment in Pakistan. A third of the country has been underwater. Farmers have lost everything. They've lost their fields, they've lost their animals, they've lost their homes. how can they adapt? They need targeted loss and damage, and we need a finance facility to do that. So I hope that these areas will be high on your agenda in talking about climate justice and just transition and green economies. And let me conclude by offering a more positive narrative about the climate crisis. I do worry sometimes that we speak about, and we should, about how dangerous a time we're in, the window is closing, etc. We say all that, but actually people need a positive narrative. And I learned this from an indigenous woman called Jude Bico. She's based in New Mexico, and she has a saying in her tribe: what if our best times are still ahead of us? And they are. Our best times are still ahead of us when we've got rid of fossil fuel, because we will have cities that will be a joy to live in. We won't have the indoor and outdoor pollution. We'll have gardens, we'll have buildings that generate the energy, we'll have farms in cities themselves, but also we'll have countryside that rewilds. The 600 million people in Africa who never switched the switch for electricity will have distributed clean energy. And think what that will do for their families, particularly the women. We'll have a world that will be more equal because clean energy will be available in distributed form all around the world. That is doable. That is part of the narrative. Why does it make such a difference? Because it empowers people. Because what we have to say is, yes, we are heading for our best times, but we're also heading for our worst times. We have a choice. What do we want to do? And yes, we don't have much time. So that's why we need a kind of moonshot mentality. And what we're saying as women leaders is, you know, John F. Kennedy put his man on the moon in 8 years. He said it was impossible at the time, and it was done. There are 7 years from January to 2030. And you know that we have to reduce by 45% at least carbon emissions. We have to restore biodiversity seriously. We have to protect our oceans. We have to, reduce the extinction and get back the species, etc. And all of that seems impossible, but we have to do it together in a climate justice movement, which gathers in all the elements, including the private sector, very importantly. And I believe that, you know, the Climate Reality Project has been going for a long time. It's got wonderful climate activists all over the world, including in Europe. I think we need your energy and your commitment to that. And let's remember a saying of Nelson Mandela. One of my chief responsibilities at the moment is I'm chair of the elders he brought together in 2007. I follow in heavy footsteps. The first chair was Archbishop Tutu. The second chair was Kofi Annan. And you know, now I'm chair. And we often quote Mandela for lots of things, but I like his succinct way of putting it. It always seems impossible until it is done. And that is something to remember, that we have to do it. It always seems impossible. You couldn't put a man on the moon because there was no way. It happened. We can do this in the 7 years to 2030. And I rely very heavily on the Climate Reality Project and the Climate Reality Europe to push us and move us in the right direction. Thank you very much.